Hey, thanks for tuning in. Martin Gansten has joined me again. It's a pleasure having you, Martin. Thanks so much. So we're going to we're going to be talking about primary directions and Martin Gansten's book, which is here, uh, the only most definitive book on primary directions that you can um, find at this point of time. So it's a very extensive book, really mathematical and also astronomical. So it's going to give a lot of jam-packed information, if you like. So I think this book was published in 2009.
Yes.
So yeah, 2009. So yeah, it's the primary directions has fascinated not just me but many astrologers and many traditional astrologers uh, who have been part of this traditional astrology revival. So the primary directions, due to the software upgradations and technological developments, is finding its way back into the astrological community, as it was almost uh, non-existent for more than 300 or 400 years after probably William Lilly's time. So it's great to have this amazing technique today, which was in use at least since the first century CE, if I'm not wrong, or if I mean, yeah, first century CE to until 16th or 17th century William Lilly. So there has been so many changes in the technique, as it is. Evolution happens in everything, but Martin, I think you would have a better idea and probably more polished perspective of how primary directions was practiced. Um, I mean, how the change of practice of primary directions has taken place since the first century to 17th century, and how it has come up to. But even before going there, let's talk a little bit about your own journey to primary directions. So I think that would be more fascinating.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but yeah, I started out approximately 30 years ago. I started um, studying astrology seriously. I'd actually been interested in astrology from childhood up, but when I really started getting into uh, the technical side of astrology, I started out with Indian astrology. Because Western astrology at that time was mostly, or almost entirely, modern psychological style astrology, which didn't really interest me that much. So uh, I started out with Indian astrology, and then within just a few years, the traditional revival that you alluded to just now started to excuse me, started to um, gather momentum, and more books and translations started coming out. So uh, gradually, over the following decade or so, I started implementing more and more uh, of the uh, medieval Arabic and later European, um, early modern European style astrology. And with that uh, came a growing awareness of this technique called primary directions that no one really seemed to understand or use anymore. So that was sort of my way into it. And finally, about 15 years ago or so, I decided I really have to start getting getting a grip on this. Um, so I gathered all the books and information I could, and I set about trying to understand what it was and how it was used, how it had been used traditionally. And it was an intensely frustrating experience at the beginning. Partly because I don't have a mathematical background. I mean, I have high school level maths. That's all. I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't rubbish at it, but it wasn't my favorite subject either. So it was sort of average in maths, and I hadn't done any since high school. So um, getting into the nitty-gritty of spherical trigonometry was not easy, and I soon discovered that everything that I could find in print or online about primary directions seemed to have been written by people who were maths specialists for other people who were also maths specialists and or computer programmers, and I was neither. So, so I got really frustrated and angry sometimes, and that was really when I started thinking about writing a book. Sort of, if I ever learn this stuff, I'm going to write a book on it, so that others don't have to go through what I did. So that's basically the background of that book.
So,
and I did master it eventually.
Sorry?
And I did master it eventually.
Okay. Yeah, obviously. So you also teach a course on primary directions, but let's come to that as this talk takes away. So, but what I wanted to basically know is like, um, what are some of the sources that you drew upon when you started reading primary directions? Because today it's easier because we have your book, and I have to mention this. Anthony Lewis has written a nice introduction to primary directions, which is available as small ebook. So that book is also a nice book, but your book is more elaborative and it's probably the most definitive book. So I just wanted to know some of the sources that you were drawing on, because in 2009, I don't know if a lot of medieval astrology texts were translated. Some of the texts were translated by Project Hindsight, but I'm not sure what are the other sources that you drew upon, and what are the other books that were available probably during 2005 and 2006. As you mentioned, you started doing primary directions.
Mm. Yeah, I have to ransack my memory a bit. I mean, there were some modern books and articles, some in print and some online. There's one by Bob McCransky, a couple of others that I can't remember the names of right now, but that have been sort of floating around on the internet for a long time, and I'm sure they're still there. But when we're talking about ancient and medieval and Renaissance sources, then of course there's the Tetrabiblos, that is Ptolemy's work on astrology, which is really the main source, ancient source for the technique that we today call primary directions. Ptolemy explains in some detail. I mean, he's basically he's always very brief in his explanations, but primary directions is one of the things that he does take some pains to explain in some detail. And then in the medieval period, there are some Arabic authors, and as far as I recall, the two of the ones that were available in translation at that time, because I don't read Arabic. Okay. I do read some Greek and some Latin. They're not my primary classical languages. That's Sanskrit, but I can sort of make my way through a passage of astrological Greek or Latin, but no, not Arabic. So what was available in translation at that time was Al-Qabisi's Introduction to Astrology, translated by Charles Burnett and a few other scholars whose names I don't recall offhand. Also Michio Yano in Japan had translated Kusher ibn Labban's Introduction to Astrology, which also has a section on primary directions. So at least those two. I don't recall offhand if there were any other Arabic sources available at that time. Then, of course, there were the Renaissance sources, where you have Placidus. So there's a translation available of his Primum Mobile, I think it's just called, which explains to some extent his take on primary directions.
Okay.
There's also Morin, that is Morinus,
Morin, yeah.
The French astrologer who lived in the early 16th century. No, sorry, early 17th century. And then, of course, William Lilly has a bit on primary directions. So there were some sources, but I did get the distinct feeling that many people just sort of skipped over those parts when they read Placidus or Morinus or William Lilly. They just sort of skimmed through the chapters and primary directions.
Okay. Okay, so spherical trigonometry. So do you teach spherical trigonometry?
Do I teach it?
Yeah, do you teach it as a part of your course? I'm not asking whether you teach spherical trigonometry as a sole subject, but do you teach it as a part of your course?
Well, yes and no. Not in great detail. That would sort of take it too far afield. What I do is I explain
obviously in line with primaries.
Yes. Now, what I do is I try to explain conceptually what it is we're doing. Spherical trigonometry simply means trigonometry is measuring triangles, right? It's trigonometry. So measuring triangles. And that is, we have 2 points and we use them to find the position of a third point. And spherical means you do this not on a flat surface, but on a round surface, that is on the celestial globe. So I teach people this conceptually, and then I teach them how to calculate things using an ordinary scientific calculator, either a handheld calculator, or you can use the one that's in your computer, or perhaps today even in your smartphone. I don't know if there are any smartphone calculators that do sexagesimal calculations. Maybe there are. I've never tried it.
I'm not sure.
But anyway, so I sort of teach a middle path.
Okay, cool. So I think it's probably the right time to define primary directions. So,
yeah. Okay. Right. So to begin with the name, they've been known as primary directions since the 17th century. And it was Placidus, the Italian astrologer, Placidus, or Placido de Titi, who called them that because he invented something that he called secondary directions. So because he had these secondary directions, he had to call the other technique primary directions. They used to be called simply directions.
Sure.
Just directions.
Mm-hmm.
And it was known actually in Greek, which is the original language of this technique, as far as we know. It was used first in Hellenistic Egypt. And it was known in Greek under several names. Aphesis, meaning sending out, or sometimes translated as releasing, which means you have, conceptually, you have a point in the horoscope, something like the ascendant or the sun or the moon or some other important point, and symbolically you send it out to move across the chart, and you see as it goes forward along the zodiac, which planets will it meet, which aspects will it meet, and when will it pass through the terms, or bounds, as they're sometimes called today, these segments of the sign ruled by different planets. So that is the technique of sending out. And directio in Latin That is, direction is just translation of this. It also means sending something out in a straight line. And similar in Arabic, it's called tasir. So at-tasir, the sending out, which was also borrowed into medieval Latin. So you can see it called at-tasir in Latin texts. But another word for the same technique in Greek was peripatos, which means moving around, walking around. So, which, if you want to give it a little fancier name, you can call it circumambulation, which is Latin for moving around, walking around. So peripatos or circumambulation just means moving around the chart, moving around the horoscope. And that's what we're doing. So you can say that the technique actually has two stages to it. One of them is symbolic. That's the easy part. You have a point like the ascendant. Say you're born with Aries rising at 20 degrees, and you just sort of move that point symbolically forward in your imagination. You see, okay, so it will reach the end of Aries and it will enter Taurus, and the first terms of Taurus will belong to Venus, so it will go through the terms of Venus, and then Saturn casts a trine aspect into those terms, so it will come to the trine of Saturn. Okay, so you get the idea. It's just moving something forward. Now, the difficult part is the maths. That's where the spherical trigonometry comes in. That's when we try to see how can we make this happen using natural motion. The ascendant as a point is, of course, fixed. The horizon is a fixed circle, imaginary circle, but still fixed. So it doesn't really move. What does move is the zodiac and all the planets, which move around the place of observation, full circle in 24 hours. You with me so far? Everything moves around us in 24 hours. The sun rises and culminates and sets and then rises again next morning. And the same is true for all the planets and all the zodiacal signs. So if we want to move the ascendant from one sign into the next sign, what we really do, astronomically speaking, is follow the natural cycle that will bring that sign to the horizon in the east, to the ascendant. Okay? That's the easiest example, using the ascendant.
Okay.
Now you can do the same with the midheaven. Then we're not talking about rising times and rising signs, but culminating times, culminating signs.
Sure.
And the most, mathematically speaking, the most difficult scenario, but also the most common scenario, is that you have a significator such as the sun or the moon that is somewhere in the chart that is not on an angle, not on the ascendant, not on the midheaven. And you want to direct that, which means you have to calculate when a particular part of the zodiac will pass over the point in space that was occupied by the sun or the moon. That's actually a bit of a simplification as well, but let's stick with that for the time being. So that's calculating all of this, not by symbolic motion, but by actual physical, natural motion. That's where we need spherical trigonometry. And it's the same kind of calculations that we use, or that we would have to use to calculate a basic natal horoscope if we didn't have computers to do it for us.
Yeah. So today the job is made easier because there are applications that can calculate
Yes.
the movements of
Yes.
planets. Yeah.
And also nowadays more applications are beginning to come that do calculate primary directions correctly. A problem used to be that there used to be some programs that did it, but did it incorrectly because the programmers didn't understand primary directions either. Which meant that people were using the output from these applications and believing them to be traditional style primary directions, which they weren't.
Okay. So, do you think we can talk about the ascensional, right ascension, declination, and ascensional times? Because this seems to be a blind area for many people who kind of try to get into primary directions in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. There are simply several different coordinate systems. I mean, if we look up into the sky, at least if it's nighttime and not too cloudy and we're not in an area polluted by too much artificial light, then we can see the planets, some of the planets in the sky, if we know where to look. And we can see some of the constellations that make up the zodiac. But when we try to define the exact position of a planet or some other point in the sky, there are different coordinate systems we can use. Now, the one that astrologers typically are familiar with is the ecliptical system. That is what we know as the Zodiac Degrees. And as astrologers, we typically use 0 to 30 degrees in a given sign. Astronomers used to do that. Now they don't. Now they just use the vernal equinoctial point, and they calculate 360 degrees from that point. So they don't use the division into signs. But we as astrologers still use the older system where we have the signs. So we're used to saying that a planet is at, say, 13 degrees of Scorpio. And that is actually, we have this circle, imaginary great circle in the sky, which we call the ecliptic, which is actually the observable path of the sun during the course of a year. And the zodiac is a belt surrounding that circle, some degrees north and some degrees south of that circle. And when we say that, say Jupiter is at 13 degrees of Scorpio, it's not that Jupiter is necessarily exactly on the ecliptic. Usually it isn't. Usually it's slightly above or slightly below, that is slightly north or south of the ecliptic. So what we mean when we say it's in 13 degrees of Scorpio is that if you draw a straight line from Jupiter to the ecliptic, then it will cut the ecliptic, intersect the ecliptic at 13 degrees of Scorpio. So that's the ecliptical system that we're used to.
Sure.
Now the equator, the celestial equator, is just another circle in the sky, which is tilted with respect to the ecliptic, right? So you imagine like two hoops, slightly tilted to each other, and of course, just as you use you draw a straight line from the planet to the ecliptic and say this is the point where it is in the ecliptic, you can do the same with the equator, celestial equator. And then you get another figure. And that figure is also measured from the vernal equinoctial point, that is 0 degrees areas in the tropical zodiac. But it's not divided into signs. So it's just a measurement in 360 degree format. So that position along the equator, that is the planet's right ascension. But again, usually the planet won't be exactly on that circle. It will be slightly above or slightly below, slightly north or south of the circle. So that distance, north or south, is what we call declination.
Uh-huh.
So it's
Cool.
just it's a different coordinate system. And the reason that it's relevant to us when we're doing primary directions is that primary directions are all about the natural cycle of rising, culminating, setting, anti-culminating, and then rising again. And that motion is accomplished by the rotation of the Earth around its axis, because one full makes a full circle in 24 hours. And to us, of course, we don't experience that we're rotating. What we see is the celestial sphere moving around our place of observation. So that's the observational astronomical point of view. And that motion takes place along the celestial equator. The equator is simply the circle that is at right angles to the axis of the Earth. So if you imagine a spinning top, a child's toy, you spin it and it moves around. So like that, the circle in which the top is moving, that is the celestial equator. So that's why it's important.
I think you've given a reasonably, long description in your
Reasonably
book.
long, yeah. Not sure if it's clear.
Yeah. So in the third chapter, I think it's the three-dimensional chart. So it's So you've dealt with. I mean, you've dealt with it in a very the reasonably long manner in your book. So, but let's get into the primary directions itself. So directing, I think there are two types of primary directions that you mentioned in the book. One is simply associating the movements with the horizon and the meridian points, and the other is directing any point or any planet to a specific point in the chart itself. So, and you also say that one thing is far more easier and also classical, which was used. Other is a little bit, I don't know how you explain it. I'm not sure whether you mentioned complicated, but so I'm just forgetting how you exactly termed it. So should we just get into that part, like the two types of primary directions? I mean, directing the points.
Right. If I understand you correctly, what you're getting at is the difference between directing the angles,
Yeah, exactly,
on the one hand, and directing points that are not on the angles.
Sure. Yes.
Right. Okay. So actually, classically speaking, there are three possible scenarios. As I alluded to briefly just before, either you're directing the ascendant or a point that is on the ascendant. Like if you were born exactly at sunrise, then you direct the sun just as you would direct the ascendant, because they're on the same at the same point. And that is done entirely by what is known as oblique ascension, or rising times. Because you're trying to find out how long it will take for a certain point to rise, that is to come to the horizon.
Sure.
Okay. Now, on the other hand, that is mode number one. That is fairly easy.
Yeah.
Mode number two is equally easy. It's if you're directing the midheaven, or a planet that is directly on the midheaven, such as if you were born exactly at local noon, that is when the sun was culminating. So that point, the midheaven or the point on the midheaven, will be directed entirely by right ascension, not oblique ascension, but right ascension, which is another way of saying culminating times. not rising times, but culminating times. So you find out how long it takes for a certain point to culminate, that is to reach the highest point in the sky. So those are the two simple methods, and they're fairly easy to calculate, oblique ascension or right ascension. The tricky part is, as I said before, if the point you want to direct is, say you have the moon in the 11th house, and you want to direct it to some aspect or other, or some other planet or whatever. So it's in the 11th house, it's not on the ascendant, it's not on the midheaven, it's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
So what Ptolemy does is he uses mixed ascensions, which is basically a sort of sliding scale between oblique ascension and right ascension. So the ancient and medieval way of calculating that actually demonstrates quite clearly that it is mixed ascensions, because you calculate the same direction twice, first in oblique ascensions, then in right ascensions, and then you use a sort of formula to find the precise point on a sliding scale between the two, which will give you the time when a certain aspect or body or whatever it is comes to the place that was natally occupied by the moon, your significator. So that was the method of Ptolemy, mixed ascensions, or what is more often known as the semi-arc method, proportional semi-arcs. Semi-arc because as a planet moves from rising to setting, it describes an arc across the sky, right? And that arc is cut in half by the midheaven, where it culminates. So it's cut into two semi-arcs. So it's a semi-arc method. Now, sometime in the Middle Ages, I believe in the 10th century, at least that's the earliest I've seen, there was an Arab astronomer, astrologer, mathematician named Al-Jayani, who came up with a different method, where he said, no, we don't need mixed ascensions. What we do is we construct a sort of artificial horizon, a pseudo horizon, that goes through this moon in the 11th house, or whatever your significator is. You construct a horizon that would put the moon on that horizon, and then you just use ordinary rising times to direct things to that horizon. And this will be close to what Ptolemy did, but it will not be identical.
Okay.
So in practical terms, there may be a difference of a year or two in when the directions perfect. So everyone is agreed on what the arc of direction will be if you direct a planet on the ascendant or you direct a planet on the midheaven. But with these intermediate directions, there are two basic schools, and the directions, the arcs of directions will come out slightly different.
Okay.
So this second method was, as I said, it was first used, as far as I know, in the 10th century by an Arabic astrologer, but it really became well known and popular in Europe only in the 15th century.
Okay.
With someone called Regiomontanus, whose real name was Johann Müller. He was German, but he was from a place called Königsberg, which means King's Mountain. So he just translated that into Latin. It became Regiomontanus. So he was known as Regiomontanus, and so he popularized this system of direction and the associated. He calculated house cusps by the same method. So there's a house system named after him, and also a system of direction based on the same principles. And this really caught on, probably because he made very good tables. He published some tables, and this was right at the beginning of the soon after the invention of printing technology in Europe.
Okay.
Right. So right at the beginning of this technological revolution, he published these tables, and they became very widespread, very popular, which meant that people were adopting his system. And this is the system that you find, for instance, Morin or Morinus in France, and also William Lilly in England. So they both used primary directions according to the Regiomontanus model. And then slightly later, in the 17th century, Placidus came along and said, no, let's go back to Ptolemy.
Yeah, I think, it's very famous. I think many astrologers address this as go back to Ptolemy movement or something like that. So
yes.
it's very famous among the traditional astrology.
So that's what Placidus wanted to do. Of course, then he did go back as far as the calculation of directions are concerned, the arcs of directions. He did go back to Ptolemy, although he also invented what he thought of as a shortcut, which becomes a third method, which is a sort of hybrid between Ptolemy and Regiomontanus, but it's much closer to Ptolemy, usually called directing under the pole of the significator. But in addition to that, Placidus also launched a huge amount of inventions. I mean, he invented all these mundane aspects and various techniques that were never in Ptolemy, but he claimed that they were Ptolemaic.
Okay.
So he did invent quite a lot as well.
Okay.
Which of course is usually the case with anyone who says let's go back. Usually they end up inventing a lot of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, it's a common theory today as well. A lot of people call something as a classic, but you don't find those in classical texts. So I think along with the types of directions, we also went back to talk about how the technique has changed over centuries. I think we also touched upon that topic, which was probably following the types of directing. So aspects. So aspects is at least at this point of time, I don't think I'm using aspects a lot. I'm just sticking to finding out a specific time to calculate the director chart, and I try to find out the time lord, and I assess the person's life using the the promisor and its position in the natal chart. So, however, when it comes to aspects, I think things get a bit tricky or something like that, if I'm not wrong. So it would be great, yeah.
Well, it's not that. It's actually the same sort of process as if you're directing something to a body or to a particular set of terms or whatever. As long as we're talking about traditional zodiacal aspects, we'll not get into the mundane aspects of Placidus.
Okay, yeah, it's about zodiacal aspect and also aspects specific to the bounds. So please go on.
So let's say, for instance, that you have 20 degrees of Aries rising in your birth chart. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then you have, let's say you have Venus in Capricorn at 10 degrees.
Okay.
Okay. So, and you want to find out when is my ascendant directed to the trine of Venus? Because that would be a very nice thing.
Yeah,
probably.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'll I'll get a girlfriend or whatever.
Yeah.
Venus is a universal significator of love and marriage and so on. And of course, if you've got Aries rising, that also means Venus is ruling the seventh house.
Yeah.
So Venus would be a very good planet, typically speaking, for love and relationships, and a trine aspect is a good aspect. So that might be a nice time.
Yeah.
So when do I get this direction, ascendant to the trine of Venus? Well, if you've got Aries rising and you've got Venus at 10 degrees of Capricorn, that means one of the two trine aspects of Venus will fall at 10 degrees of Taurus.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
So you just find out at what time did 10 degrees of Taurus
to 10 degrees of Taurus.
Exactly. Sure. When was 10 degrees of Taurus rising after your birth? And you find out that, well, it took 1 hour and 4 minutes, perhaps, from the time of your birth.
Yeah. So exactly. Yes.
So 64 minutes of time. And then you know that 1 degree of the equator rises in approximately 4 minutes. So you just divide 64 by 4 and you get 16. So when you're 16 years old, you'll have your first girlfriend, perhaps.
Okay, I hope this hypothetical person is happy.
Yes. So that is the same process as if you actually have a planet at 10 degrees of Taurus, and you want to find when that planet comes to the ascendant, or if you're just interested in, say, when the ascendant will enter the terms of Jupiter, let's say, which would be at 8 degrees of Taurus.
8 degrees, yeah.
So the process is the same, whether you're actually directing to a planet, that is to a body, or you're directing to an aspect point or to the beginning of a set of terms. I still use this word terms, by the way,
sure.
Which is what you'll find in all the traditional books. I mean, if you read books translated into English, if you read William Lilly, and if you read translations that were published, up until very recently, this is the word you'll find. Nowadays, we have a sort of explosion of different translations. Some people want to translate the word this way and others translate it the other way. With the idea of bringing out the original meaning of the words more clearly, which I think is fine in itself. But the problem is that if we're all using different words for the same thing, it will really be very confusing at the end. You know?
No.
If you stick with just reading the translations of one person, then that's fine, yeah? Unless that person actually changes his mind over time, which some people also do or have done. But I prefer to stay with the older terminology because that will make it easier to read older sources. So that's why I say terms. Other people will say bounds. Some people will even say confines.
Okay.
Not sure if there are other translations on that, but it's the same thing. If you're reading circumambulation through the bounds, it's the same thing as primary directions through the terms.
So the terms distribution through the bounds, primary directions, and circumambulation. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a huge confusion when I initially started with primary directions. So it's that was one of the biggest confusions for me because I did not have so many books that at this point of time I'm having 2 or 3 books that talk about primary direction. That's fine, but before that it was very difficult to differentiate what it was. So, yeah.
Yes.
So
I should just add one thing there. When I say it's the same thing, Actually, if you go really far back, some people used only oblique ascensions for everything, that is
Mm.
rising times. And that is Ptolemy, who was writing in the 2nd century, so approximately 1,800 years ago, he said that this is the common way, but we're not going to do it that way because it's not astronomically defensible. It's a crude, approximate method, and it's really only viable if you're directing the ascendant. It's fine as long as you're directing the ascendant to use rising times, but it's not fine if you're directing the midheaven or a planet in some other place of the chart. So there have been some people who have argued that we should do it the way the oldest way and just use rising times for everything. And well, good luck to them. I don't think it works.
Okay.
But some people, when they speak of circumambulation through the bounds or whatever they call it, they have this idea in mind.
Oh, there's only one oblique ascension and not the right ascension.
Only use oblique ascensions. So that would be different from what I might call classical primary directions.
Okay. So that's probably one difference. Okay, cool. That's clear now.
Okay.
Okay. So I think you gave a very good overview of your book, except that you cannot teach spherical trigonometry. But let's get into this is not the right platform, and it could take ages. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is how to use primary directions in combination with various other techniques, maybe a real-time technique like transits, or an yearly technique like solar revolutions, or annual perfections. So how do we use it? Because I have one specific method of using primary directions with solar revolutions and perfections. So I think you're going. You're already in the process of writing a book in terms of using all these techniques along with primary directions. So what's your take on this, and how do you? Is there a specific sequential pattern that you follow to make it easier for the readers, or the upcoming astrologers, or whatsoever?
Yes, that's right. I'm actually well on my way to finishing this book. I hope it'll be out sometime in the spring or early summer of 2020. Annual predictive techniques of the Greek, Arabic, and Indian astrologers. That's the working title. So as you can understand from the title, it's about annual predictions. But primary directions play an important part in that, a very important part. And actually, it's based to a large extent, or at least I use the framework of Ptolemy's exposition of these techniques, because he has this sequence of what he calls universal chronocratos, or time laws. That is the planets that are active by primary direction. And then the annual chronocratos, the annual time laws, which are the planets that are activated by annual profections. And then he has the transits. Well, he also has monthly and daily profections, if you want to get into that. And he says, in all of this, you should always consider the transits, which play a great part. So what he says is that the directions they have the greatest impact in determining results, what is actually going to happen. But the profections will either reinforce that or counteract it, and they may even delay the result. Let's say you have a very positive direction coming up, The ascendant is directed to the trine of Jupiter in the 11th house or whatever.
Okay.
So something very positive is going to happen, but then you have a really, a perfection where Saturn is ruler of the year or Mars is ruler of the year, and it's really horribly placed in your chart. So this malefic will say no, and and the direction won't take effect, or won't take full effect at least, as long as that perfection is active. But once the malefic perfection has moved away, then the direction can manifest in full. So the annual chronocrators have this intermediate role, and then there are the transits, which intensify or
The trigger points.
Sorry?
The trigger points.
Trigger points, you could say, yes. So those are the techniques mainly used by Ptolemy. Then other Hellenistic authors, and especially the Persian and later the Arabic authors, included annual revolutions. That is what is called solar returns today, where you cast a whole new chart for the time when the sun returns to its natal position. And that, of course, is what most people will think about when they hear annual predictions. They will think about the solar return chart, and that's an important part of it. But traditionally, you don't use the solar return chart as a standalone technique.
Okay.
So what you do is first you see what directions are active. And you look at the most important chronocrators. The ascendant will usually be one of them. If the sun or the moon is your high leg, as I say, the main significator of life, then you may look at that as well. Perhaps the midheaven, if you're especially interested in work prospects and things like that. So depending on what you're looking for, you may choose your significators accordingly, but usually the ascendant is one of the main ones. And you see what terms is the directed ascendant going through at the moment. Is it going through the terms of Venus or Jupiter, or Mars or Saturn, or Mercury, which is more neutral, and how is that planet placed in the nativity, and so on. So you get a general idea, and also are there any aspects of the planets falling in those terms, and so on. So you get a general idea of which planets are ruling the period. You could say this is the primary directions equivalent to a dasha ruler in Indian astrology.
That's what I was thinking.
Yes. So it's like finding the dasha lord. And then you can say the annual perfections, that's like going to the sub-period, the Bhukti Lord.
That's fantastic.
So when you know which planets are actually active, you know that, okay, in this year, Jupiter and Mars are the two planets that are particularly activated. Then those are the planets that you specifically look for in the chart of the revolution, the solar return chart. And I've seen, I'll give, in my book, I actually give a couple of examples where almost every planet in the solar return chart is wonderfully placed.
Okay.
Except the planets that really count.
Okay, so it's almost counting to my situation currently.
Like you have there's one that comes to mind right now. I won't give the whole story, it's in the book, but out of 7 planets, 5 were either exalted or in their own signs. There's the sun in his own sign, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and the moon, all dignified and most of them in good houses. But the 2 planets that were active as Time Lords or chronocrators were Mars and Saturn. And Mars was in the 8th and Saturn was in the 6th of the revolution. And it was really a shit year, you know? So it's really horrible.
I mean,
year.
it's sheer bad luck.
Yes. So if you try to find on the internet, you know, how to read a solar return chart, you'll find any number of websites and blogs and whatnot that will tell you just read it like you would read a natal chart.
Okay.
But understanding that it's just valid for 1 year. And if you did that, you'd really go wrong. Really, really.
Sure.
Horribly wrong in this case. And of course, there are instances where it's the other way around. You know, most of the chart looks horrible, but the 1 or 2 planets that really count are actually very well placed. And this will be a good year. So,
sure.
So the solar return chart or annual revolution is a very useful tool, but it has to be used, I think, in relation to these techniques that are higher up in the predictive hierarchy. And then, of course, there's a whole question of sidereal or tropical revolutions, because it's not, you know, when you cast a natal chart, if you do it in a sidereal or a tropical zodiac, they will look different, but not completely different, because the houses will be the same. The planets will be in the same houses. If you're born at sunrise, then you have the sun in the first house, whether you use a tropical zodiac or a sidereal zodiac.
Sure.
Right? So the planets will be in the same houses. They will form the same mutual aspects. It's just that most of them will be displaced by one sign, depending on whether you use tropical or sidereal. But because the sidereal year is slightly longer than the tropical year, 20 minutes longer,
sure,
which is a cumulative difference. You know, for every year of life, you add another 20 minutes. It means that by the time you're in your mid-30s, your sidereal revolution will actually be 12 hours later than the tropical revolution. So you have a completely different horoscope, not just the sign placements, but the house placements will be different. And the moon will be different. And you know, the fast-moving planets will form different aspects sometimes. So basically, it's a whole different horoscope. So the sidereal and tropical revolution or solar return chart they differ much more from each other than the respective nativities do. So there's a fertile ground for research here, and I think it's possible for someone who's a little bit objective. It's possible to find which works best. And there are, of course, some people who use a tropical zodiac, but who still think that the sidereal revolutions do seem to work better. So they use a sort of hybrid. They use the year, but the tropical zodiac.
And there are some people who also use tropical year for a sidereal zodiac. So.
Oh, really? I haven't seen that variant. Okay.
Yeah, that's very much there. Yeah, I know.
So, excuse me. So there are all these variables, but the point is, primary directions were always meant to be used with other techniques. If you read some astrological authors from the 20th century, they will present primary directions as if they were meant to time things to the month and even to the day. That was never the point of primary directions, and in my opinion, it can't be done. Of course, you know, if you throw in all kinds of outer planets and asteroids and this and that and hypothetical planets, and you use all kinds of minor aspects, then chances increase that on a given date something will hit something. And
Yeah,
then
but I think it's easier to use profections and solar revolutions.
yes, yes, and that's certainly the more traditional way. So, so if you see that um, you have Jupiter and Mars, for instance, as the ruling planets for a particular year, one perhaps by direction and one by profection, and then you look at how they are placed in the revolution, and then you look at their transits. It's manageable. You can actually make predictions instead of just having to justify everything once it's happened.
Okay.
You can.
Sure. Yeah, you can really be an astrologer.
Yes.
Okay. So your book is coming out sometime during the early next year.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, great. So I surely look forward to the book, and so let's also bring out something about your course on primary directions, because I don't know if anyone else actually has an extensive course as you do on primary directions.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Yeah. So please uh, talk about what you offer on your course, and I think your website is martingansten.com.
It is.
So yeah.
It is. It's horribly out of date, but but it's
No,
still
I think
there.
it's very clean and precise, even though it's not a very new looking website.
No,
But it offers all the necessary information. So yeah.
I'm going as soon as I have time. I'm going to work on that a bit, but it's still up and running,
Okay,
and
good.
it's possible to contact me. It's possible to take the course. So the course is it was a natural development of the book. The book came out in 2009, and I think it took another 3 or 4 years before I started offering the course, because people were reading the book and writing to me and asking for more details on this or that,
Okay.
and especially with regard to the calculation part. And the course was formulated at a time when there still wasn't as much of a choice with regard to software as there is today. So it's largely geared towards learning to calculate directions for yourself, and leading up to the point where you can actually start using software confidently, because you know what it's supposed to be doing, and if
Yeah, sure.
if you need to, you can actually cross-check it with your own calculations and see if it's done properly. So the course starts off by a sort of general introduction to the various coordinate systems of astrology and the technical vocabulary of primary directions. So those are the two first lessons, and then you start gradually, step by step, introducing how to calculate these various data that you need, the right ascension and oblique ascension, all of these things, and then learning how to direct the angles, and then learning how to direct points that are not on the angles by both the methods that we were discussing before, the Ptolemaic and the Regiomontanus way, and also some other variables that are necessary to consider. You have on certain points you just have to make a decision, because it's possible, mathematically it's possible to do things in different ways, and you just have to decide conceptually what you want to do. Like, for instance, do you want to use the actual bodies of the planets in the sky, or do you want to use the points on the ecliptic? If you draw a line from the body to the ecliptic, you get the zodiacal position of the planet. So do you want to use that, or do you want to use the real body of the planet? And some people lean towards one option and some to the other. And so you have to understand what are the different technical variables. And so that's one lesson. Then I have a separate lesson dealing with the topic of length of life, which is something that primary directions were traditionally used for. It's important to understand that you will not automatically be able correctly to predict someone's length of life just from taking this one lesson in my course. It's just meant to introduce. It's meant to introduce the basic methods that we use, and then I have one complete lesson on all the all the inventions of Placidus. That's usually people think that's the most challenging lesson, but it's towards the end, so they have a fair bit of calculation under their belt by then. There's a separate lesson on combining primary directions with other techniques, as we just discussed. And there's also a separate lesson on modern, that is 19th and 20th century inventions and developments in directions. And the very last lesson is actually about using software to calculate primary directions.
Okay, so I'm happy that it's the last chapter.
Yes, because when you have this application in front of you, and you see that there's a menu of settings, options or whatever it's called, and you have all these different variables, and you're just sitting there looking at them, and you don't know what anything means, so you just start ticking boxes randomly and see what comes out. So that's if you haven't taken my course, that is. So the idea is that if you take the first 11 lessons, then by lesson 12, which is the last lesson, hopefully you will know what you're doing when you're ticking those boxes. You will know what they mean. Placidus, regimentanus, with latitude, without latitude, this option, that option. So you'll be able to.
So I was basically doing something similar before a year or so. Just randomly try and
yes.
But later on I just had a lot of customizations for my own needs. And things are okay. And, okay. So I think that pretty much brings us towards the end of the discussion. If you have something else more to say.
Not off the top of my head. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but
no, I think I just didn't. We covered everything that we want to do, but I did not want this to be a lesson on primary directions, but this could be a small overview because there is your book is there, and you also have a course, and I think that it's just that I want to touch up on this topic with you, having written a very important book. So this is basically the reason why I wanted to have you. So, and it's not always easy to find on YouTube something about primary directions as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
Let's hope people find this if they're searching for primary directions.
Yeah, if someone searches for primary directions, yes. So okay, I think that pretty much brings us towards the end of the show, and thank you so much, and I eagerly look forward to your book, and so that is probably going to give us another chance to get back. So I'm already pre-booking your schedule, so
that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you.